Hey there YouTube, welcome to Big Mike Beard Wisdom. So, we're finishing up with the deck coat. Well, sort of. But it's one of those things where whenever you use this, you can hope everything's going to work out perfect, but sometimes stuff messes up. And that's kind of what happened here. This is kind of interesting. Essentially, we got about a ½ inch of rain last night. And this would be around like the 32-hour mark since we put the paint down, and you can see we got quite a few bubbles underneath it. So it didn't bubble everywhere. There only seems to be, you know, certain locations. So like right across this board here is fine till you get to about here. That's pretty bubbly. That's bubbly. That's bubbly too. So it's like all along this edge here is bubbly. This is bubbly. This step looks to be almost fine until you get to be about right there, and then it gets bubbly. That's fairly bubbly. So this is the point where, you know, this should have been good for light traffic and putting heavy objects back on the porch. Yesterday at 5 p.m. it didn't rain until maybe like 1 a.m. that night. So again, you know, pretty good ways in. And it's kind of weird because I don't quite know why it bubbled where it bubbled. Because it didn't bubble all over. There's a couple bubble spots right about there, and then it bubbled over there. But it's not a consistent bubbling. So there's the bubbles here, bubbles here. This section here is fairly bubble free. That's got some bubbles. A little bit over there. Really, really bubbly. Again, really bubbly. Backboard. Almost not bubbly at all. The top of the rail, pretty decent. Then you get bubbly. Anyone remember that pizza thing? It's a bubbly. But it's kind of one of those things where it's sort of interesting. I don't understand why it did it, but that kind of sucks. We were planning on not letting the boys out at the back door until like this morning, but with the rain I just wanted to be extra safe and make sure that everything was nice and good and dry. I mean, it's still nice and dry, just the bubbles are weird. So I think maybe we'll keep them off the porch a little bit, see if the bubbles go down, or if somehow that's water that's permeated into it and kind of screwed it up. And then as a simple observation, it does look like everywhere where there's these bubbles, there's a little bit of wetness still. So it's still damp there. Meanwhile, it's super dry on the part that's nice and flat. So I don't know if it's a standing water, sitting water kind of thing or something. But you can kind of see where it's shiny right there, and a little bit right there. That's where we've got a little bit of bubbles. So there's a little bit of bubbles there, there, and there. It's been about 3 hours, so it's now about 11. And as I'm looking at this, I tried squishing the one just to see if it was just air. It's definitely not air, that definitely has water in it. So that's kind of a bummer. It's about 3 in the afternoon, and as you can see, a bunch of those bubbles have gone away. So, and I'm on the deck. That's pretty nice. So there's still a handful of them floating around, but for the most part they went away. And I have noticed it is very, very white, so you can definitely see dirty shoe prints. But pretty happy that those have disappeared. The deck is very, very white, especially when the sun's out. So some of the spots wind up being like a little bit too thin, so really that's on us for, you know, maybe not putting it thick enough. But pretty interesting. A couple days in now, the bubbles have pretty much gone away. The deck's gotten dirty because we've been using it. I am not going to clean this for a while because it takes 7 days for this to fully cure and be done. So it'll be interesting to see how that winds up turning out. We touched up the spots we missed last night. So when I say last night, I mean like 8:30, which was like right at sunset. So we touched up that area. Front parts of the steps here. These spots. And the big thing that we noticed was that this morning, even though it's been about 14 hours, it's still wet. So with the dew that kind of came and like a really high humidity last night, this didn't really dry well. So it's one of those things where if you've got a kind of crappy weather situation, you might be having a hard time with it. But what I'm hoping is that we give this a little bit of time, this will dry up. And I don't quite know how that got scratched up like that right there. Part of me wonders if something didn't jump on the porch last night. But this was the whitest deck for about a day. And then as soon as everybody started walking on it, yeah, it got dirty again. And I did notice this morning over here was like the return of some of the bubbles. They were much larger bubbles, but those bubbles are gone now. So instead of being like the whole bunch of like little tiny bubbles, it was probably maybe like a couple almost like fingertip, so about that part of my finger size bubbles. I'm kind of thinking that doesn't bode well for it. So if every time it gets wet somehow it bubbles up a little bit, I'm a little worried that we're going to have an issue. But it was only really noticeable in this spot over here. Everywhere else seemed to be nice and flat. I'm still hopeful that somehow it's going to manage to adhere itself down and be okay. But time's really going to tell, and it's going to be interesting to see how it goes. And the other deck's looking pretty good too. But it's one of those things where you definitely want to be taking breaks, because otherwise you might speed up and not put down enough product so that it looks like you whitewashed it. And that was one of the reasons why I called customer service. If you have any questions about the Rustoleum stuff, call customer service. They are awesome. So I don't know if I talked to the same lady somehow, magically. I called about 4 hours apart. Really, I should have wrote down like my questions. But I asked about, with the rain and the bubbles, what to do. And she had mentioned that that was kind of normal for like if it rains and stuff, but it should go away. If it doesn't go away overnight, then essentially it would have to be scraped up and redone. We got lucky, it went away. And then I called later and said, hey, what happens if we want to do a recoat? Because there's nothing on the can that says anything about recoating. And she said you have to give it about 6 hours. So in about 6 hours, I can recoat this. And I think that's the minimum, like more or less flash time for it. But she also said you don't want to let it go 7 days before recoat, because if it goes 7 days, then you have to reprime it again and then put the next coat on. So it'd be the kind of starting the process all over again. But hopefully this stuff's adhered properly and be one of those things where you're just rinsing it off with a pressure washer and then spraying her down real quick just to get it clean, free of dirt and leaves and spiders. And you'll notice all the bugs that come out whenever you're trying to paint, because they go, hi, I want to be in there. And it's really tough to get good coverage with just a paintbrush on it, because it's so thick. And then as soon as you put it on, you know, it's thicker than normal paint, so you're either spreading it too thin and you can see through it, kind of like what we have here, or it's too thick and you get a little bit of a run. Other spots, it lays out like super smooth, like here. That way you don't even see any of the wood grain, and then you'll have a thinner spot, like up there where you can see the wood grain. So, kind of interesting to try and do. The second coat works really, really well. So it's one of those things where if you're pressed for time and you're like, oh man, this needs to get done, kind of don't worry about if you put it on too thin, as long as you've got time to put a second coat on. The second coat gives you really, really good coverage. So even if it was a little thin here, it'll get much better the second coat. This has a second coat. You can see it looks way better than it did with that kind of spotchy looking first coat. So looks much better, much more consistent, much more solid white. And white's kind of a tough color to, you know, hide stuff with, because it lets everything kind of show through. But so far so good. This front deck area, we haven't had any issues as far as bubbling, but we also didn't have any kind of weird rainstorm hit. So essentially this was painted yesterday at about 3 p.m. It's about 11 p.m. or 11, so it's about 11 a.m. now. And then I did a second coat, you know, late last night about 8 p.m. So this needs to wait a good bit. And I would assume the longer that you give it before walking on it, the better chance it's going to have of being, you know, more solid in the long run and better adhesion. And then another tip would be essentially use weird stuff to mask with. So these Walmart bags work great for covering up the mailbox. The boxes work pretty good, as you can see, for hiding stuff. That way I was able to use less tape instead of having to like put it down a drop cloth. And then all these things can just be simply thrown away. Otherwise, it might be a good idea just to remove things. So in this situation, I could have removed the mailbox and avoided having to do this in the first place. It's a good thing it's a Sunday. With both the front deck and the back deck, there's a fair amount of time that you have to plan ahead with these. And especially the cleaning phase, where you're wiping her down and stuff like that, I found using a leaf blower really kind of helps speed up the drying time. And especially areas where it like contacts near the house, to blow out any like weird little gap areas and stuff like that. So it really helps with any standing water you might have. And then any areas that might not be drying quite fast enough, I found the leaf blower really kind of helped. And then in one of the videos that I saw, they said don't worry about trying to paint in between the boards because it'll do a lot of coverage by itself. And it's one of those things where I'm pretty sure we didn't get really good coverage on this one, possibly because we didn't use like their particular roller. We went to that 3/8 snap on it. And it's one of those things where this one back here, you can really see that side of the board. That's the old paint, so that's not like the paint that we put on it. You can kind of see the difference in the coloring there. So definitely one of those things where if you're doing just the top, it's kind of tough to hide that inside. And I used that knowledge, that lesson learned, on this one. So essentially what we did was we went ahead and we painted kind of like in between it. You can't get very far down in between there. You can get down a ways, but we did that real quick first, and then we did the board. Then we move on to the next board, do the in between, and then paint the top. Then move on to the next board, in between, then paint the top. That came out pretty decent, depending on how tight the boards are. So like this one's got a pretty big gap on it. This one over here is pretty tight. You can get farther in, but you can see it looks way better kind of this way, having that paint in there, than it does having the paint not in between. So longevity wise, it'll be interesting to see how it winds up working out, because I know a lot of people have said a lot of different things about like the paint peeling up starting inside of here, which might be because of a primer issue, or you know, one of those things where maybe that wasn't as clean. So this will be really interesting to see how this winds up weathering. and if the front one's about lasting the back, or if the back one's about lasting the front. And then probably one of the last tips I'll have is that I kind of think it's one of those things, the sooner you can get it done, the better. So essentially as early in the morning as possible, get it cleaned, and then hopefully get it dried. That way you can put the primer on. The primer needs 2 to 3 hours, so that's a fair amount of time again there. And then in order to avoid any kind of weird issues with dew or like overnight uncontrollable variables, try to give it as much time to dry in the daylight as possible, because I'm assuming the sun helps it if the sun's able to hit the area. Same thing with the warmer temperatures. And then you don't have to worry about the dew impacting it and it having, you know, a couple extra hours to be set up and be curing, to hopefully not have any weird effects. So all in all, it's kind of one of those things where I definitely misjudged how long this was going to take. So this was a fairly long job to do, between the cleaning, waiting for it to dry, then the priming, waiting for that to dry, and then the actual painting. And the back stuff back here where we don't have that top rail really went pretty quick. The front part with that top rail, man, that really added a lot of extra time. And we even ran into some issues. So like, I completely forgot to do that one because we ran out of paint more or less back here, and I haven't gotten around to doing that one. But I definitely say it looks way better than it did before. And really the lessons from the back deck really helped me do the front deck a lot better and a little bit differently. So if you're thinking about doing it, I would definitely recommend planning ahead, having lots of extra time, and kind of having a flexible schedule as far as when you're going to do it, because you really want to avoid rain. Essentially, it's one of those things, if you guys have any issues with it, feel free to call Rustoleum's customer support. I'd put the number up, but I don't know if it ever changes. So definitely look at the can that you have. It should be just on the back with the instructions and stuff. They're super helpful. I really wish I remember the lady's name that helped me out. Very polite. And if you've got any questions for them, I mean, it takes them, you know, a matter of seconds to look it up. Once you work through like the phone punch system, so, you know, like press 1, press 2, that kind of thing, they pretty much picked up immediately. There was very little time on hold, if any time on hold, really. So if you wind up using this and you've got any kind of issues, feel free to give them a call. They may have exactly the answer that you need in order to fix it, or what you need to do, hopefully barring, you know, scraping it up and restarting. So, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll check you next time.